So this is episode 30 of the Following Mechanical Turks project. Um, Today we'll talk a bit about the introduction. We have a draft of the introduction to go with the drafts of the methods section, the results, and the conclusion. So then the last remaining section that needs a draft is the discussion. So we'll take a look at those two things and then discuss sort of where we go from here. Am I missing anything?
No, I think that's where we're at.
Okay. So let's take a look at let me share my screen here. I'll just share the whole thing. Why not? I've been kind of continually updating the site just to sort of keep things together. Like one thing I did recently was I went through our data just to make sure there weren't things like names and email addresses in there that could be used as identifiers. So I tried to groom those out. Excuse me. I also just sort of cleaned up the links and things because some of them pointed to items that were no longer really pertinent, like an outline, right? That we didn't really need so much now because we already mostly have a draft. So the outlines shared utility was, not that significant. So you can see here, like in the data, we've got notes, which is still there because that's kind of always evolving. The raw A sample, the collected and processed results of the A sample, and then things like the keenness measures, the keenness diagrams, TF-IDF. These are all for the A sample. The feature tables and the feature diagrams, those are things in the results that, looking at the bigram diagrams and the FCMs and those kind of things. So this is the data we've got. I kind of revised the texts we've uploaded too. So right now we've got meta documents like the overview and the credits.
Okay.
Here in the drafts, we've got the components of the first product there, the text mining product. So we've got the introductions, methods, results, conclusion. This is still here. This theory draft, although this really won't be in the product there. It might pop up to the meta documents here, or potentially it'll just be unlinked. And these don't get deleted; they're just not visible.
Okay.
Anywho, so that's what's going on there. So we've got sort of a 5-part IMRAD structure, so we just need the discussion.
Yeah, and I've been plugging away at that, and I think I just need to start. I do it all. Most of it I write by hand first, so I just need to start typing it up, and then once I type it up, it should start to fall together. I just need to find the time just to get it up at this point.
Yeah. Have there been?
I haven't updated this yet, but I've got a couple pages right in front of me.
Okay, so that's the discussion. The introduction, we can talk about this a little bit. So this actually probably, I guess I actually do want to pull this up. The introduction largely picks up the same notes as the posted outline. The order is a little bit different because in this outline, it starts with the broader issue of, you can see it starts with the animating concern as the contemporary distinction between relationships among humans and non-humans. That's true, but that's also quite broad
Right, right,
considering,
right.
you
That
know,
that's probably broadly that's sort of
hmm,
the project's animating concern as opposed to
right.
the particular paper's
Well,
animating
and
concern.
yeah, and even at a even broader than that in the respect that we're really just looking at it on Turk, right? I mean,
Right,
so that's true, but you can tell this was written start to finish as an outline because it starts very broad about, here are the general issues we're interested in. So it actually starts more narrowly by, um, it really begins by focusing on what Mechanical Turk is.
yeah,
Here's what Mechanical Turk is, at least in the context of this paper, because it doesn't spend a lot of time doing that because it just would be tangential. So it starts with, here's what Turk is. Part of that is its name because that's relevant. It's not just, a quirky, how about that? It's
right,
relevant, right? Because it's based in this notion of, I want to stay away from the word deception, but the sort of acceptance of the notion of this isn't purely one thing. It's a collaboration, right? Um, so it kind of goes from, here's what it is to here's why it's valuable to look at. Here's what other fields have sort of touched upon. There's not a ton in rhetoric, and what is in rhetoric is mostly in computational linguistics, which isn't always a species of rhetoric, but they're certainly aligned,
yeah,
particularly given what we're doing. And what is there is really largely about use of Mechanical Turk in research methods, right? It's like, so here's how to use Mechanical Turk in computational linguistics when you're studying something else. There isn't a whole lot that's like, okay, but here's Mechanical Turk as a subject, not in rhetoric or linguistics. Yeah, so let me just pull it up. So it's kind of the gist. It hits these same notes really, but the sequencing is different. The first line here is really just sort of a statement of what we're doing. This study examines how the language of posts on Amazon's Mechanical Turk, an online global crowdsourced marketplace, rhetorically depicts human agency and identity. And the rest of this is, here's what Mechanical Turk is, launched in 2005, which is pretty early.
yeah.
It's 15 years at this point. Allows individuals and organizations to solicit a distributed pool and so forth. The reward is, low, which has caused some controversy. And throughout this, I'm pointing to stuff. And this
Yeah.
is kind of, it is written more, not only uses APA, but this is written more as an APA kind of document in that,
Yeah.
in a lot of the sciences, the way like sources and, literature is, you'll notice in the IMRAD structure, there's not even a dedicated lit review. That gets worked into other stuff. Usually like the methods is, okay, here's what other people have said.
Right.
And it's often dealt, as you can see here, kind of in like a, not dismissive, but sort of like, many studies have shown, X causes Y. And then there's just like a list, of Smith, Jones, Thomas, it's a different, citation systems, as I think we've discussed, they're not really just these kind of formal things of, well, here's how we cite. It's a cognitive issue of how we
Yeah.
rely upon others in conversation,
No, at the risk of seeming to make excuses for myself, and I think we talked about this a couple episodes ago, that writing the discussion section, I think, has been one of the things, at least early on, I struggled with was precisely that issue of getting into that, right? It's stylistic, but it's stylistic, and as you pointed out, cognitive at the same time, right?
Yeah.
There's a kind of instinct towards where I think if you're working in something like MLA, or even just writing a piece in that style, right? There's oftentimes a sense that you have to sort of slow down and engage those sources more directly, right? You have to do something with them as this, right? This from my standpoint, this almost feels like you're just like this is a drive-by citation where
Right.
you're just
Yes.
name checking. But in APA, you just cite them and move on to your thing.
Yes. And, of course, we're speaking in really broad generalities, but yes, I mean, I think in the sciences and in related fields, social sciences, that's I think fair to say that it's really, to me, it's a question of kind of how your field uses things like ethos, how it makes knowledge.
Yeah.
And in the humanities, and as is endorsed by MLA, it's much more of an ethos driven endeavor where these are what thinkers have thought. And
Right.
so, here's what they're talking about, and here's how I'm engaging with this. And in other fields, ethos doesn't have that same kind of purchase, where it's not really a question of here's what Jones has said, because who is Jones? It's really much more of a question of this is what studies have demonstrated. And that's
Right.
also why things like recency has so much more purpose, right? It's why
Yeah.
they foreground years, because they're like, okay, well, in the last 5 years, here's what they've said about blood type, right?
Yeah. That's why it's so weird to do, like, if you're doing something where you're citing Aristotle and you have to do it in APA.
Yeah, it's weird.
Yeah, because they're not. Yeah, I think you're right too. It gets at that, right? Whereas in something like MLA, you put this person has thought.
Yeah.
APA seems to foreground less the thinking and more the results.
The study, the product versus the thinker. Anywho, so I mean, it's interesting because and I talk about this with students because I teach this. It's not just these kinds of formal issues. It's really epistemological. It's how do you make knowledge, And we come from a background where knowledge is much more of a conversation among persons, among thinkers, and that's how we build knowledge. But here we're sort of, in terms of method, methodologically, it's more an issue of we're running certain operations, and that's where we're getting our findings from. And so it's closer to a different model of knowledge making. So yes, I mean, you do get the sense of this kind of name drop sort of citation in places, and we'll see. I mean, since this is kind of cross-disciplinary, it doesn't really have a dedicated style. I mean, I think we'll have to rely on things like feedback for people to say this is appropriate, or if you're going to mention these, you're going to need to discuss them, or whatever.
Yeah, because when I was even thinking about the introduction, right, as I was just going through our other parts that we've got composed and other notes that I have, I had a bunch of interesting quotes that I thought, my instinct is to write that really interesting Edgar Allan Poe thing about, that the only work now that remains is to parse out the human agency, right? That would make a really interesting opening. But in the kind of piece that we're writing, those are two very different ways of opening up an article, right? One that goes directly into what Mechanical Turks is and what's been said about it in 10 or 11 studies, as opposed to here's what an interesting person said about it 150 years ago, and we're picking up that question, right? Those are as you're describing it, two very different ways of approaching what we're doing.
Yeah. Well, and so that was kind of the main thing I wanted to talk about, because we have throughout kind of talked about, I mean, is this something that should go here, or should go in the introduction, or, should go into a different product, or should be dropped, or whatever.
Yeah.
And so the way the intro is written, the answer to that question is largely that would all go in the discussion or elsewhere.
Yeah.
Because following this outline, the introduction is fairly kind of hands off with a lot of that. Now, it could be revised. I mean, again, this is something that may benefit from feedback. It could be revised to either incorporate that or change the direction of how the introduction is going right now. I think what we want to be a little careful of is stuffing everything into the intro where there's this sense of get to it.
Right.
I mean, you know, particularly since this is driven by text mining, right? There's a sense of it makes sense to set that up, right? I mean, here's what we're going to do. Here's what others have said. Here's what we're going to try and do, and then, you know, move to the methodology. Here's how we're going to, or methods. Here's how we're going to try and do that, right? So yeah, I mean, this does mention like the Poe, but it doesn't digress.
Yeah.
There
That's
may
probably the good word to think about. How much do we digress in this?
Well, and there may be some latitude to do that even when he's mentioned, or to do something like start with that. I mean, it's not uncommon to start with this kind of anecdotal, right? You know, here's an anecdote that's relevant as a setup, as a hook, you know, and then get into the research questions that come from, you know, that anecdote. But, you know, also just in practical terms, so things we've discussed, like and I think this is even in the outline where it says, like, yeah, here, this discourse of the sort of Platonic notion of the human machine or human non-human split is, you know, it's kind of an ethical split. It's sort of like, you
Right.
know, the human essence is good and it's corrupted by prosthetics. I mean, he's pretty explicit about that in the Phaedrus. You know, the really well-known narrative of writing being a, you know, a potion of reminding rather than memory. I mean, he's pretty explicitly pejorative. He's like, it's
Yeah.
BS. You know, you think writing it's in the shape of a person, but it's, you know, quite literally dumb in that it can't talk to you, right? You ask writing a question and it can't talk to you. It's dumb. And so, I mean, you know, there's this thread of, you know, of sort of like a moral or ethical judgment that's been there since the get-go.
Yeah.
And, you know, that conversation is still there. I mean, you know, it's, as I was talking about here in the outline, where it's this, you know, this goalpost moving, where it's like, but humans are so great. They have these creative capacities. And then when it's shown sort of inevitably, oh, well, others can do that. I mean, now principally machines, but of course, historically, this is kind of waxed and waned with other stuff, right?
Right.
And that's, I mean, what the Turk is. It's like, oh, it can play chess, which is this fancy, you know, test of intellect, right? I mean, chess
Right.
is still that. It's a fancy thing. And so when it's shown that stuff can do that, there's goalpost moving where it's like, oh, okay, yeah, but it's still not a true human, because true humans can do that. You know, it's this
Right.
no
Yeah.
Scotsman thing.
And that's where the king becomes helpful, because he sort of traces that shifting goalpost.
So this doesn't really come up in the introduction because I didn't know how much time to spend on this conversation. Now there's actually space, and in fact, I put a note in the draft that says this wants more proof, which is probably where that could go. I don't really know enough about this conversation. It's kind of hand waved a little bit in the introduction, in the way that I just did it, where it's like, well, that thread of sort of moral judgment is still there, even in people who align on the other side of it, right? The notion of, well, no, humans or machines and computers do these things, and they're either sort of like helpful augmentations of the human, sort of cybernetic, or they're partners, but in ways that are different than us, right? So they are partners in kind of like a Latourian mold, right? They are partners. It's just they're not identical to us, and our judgments are based on, we want to see ourselves reflected in them, right? You know, it's the whole artificial intelligence conversation. We don't really want artificial intelligence. That's there. I mean, the internet is vastly,
Right.
vastly, vastly more intelligent than us. I mean, exponentially. It's not even in the same ballpark. But
Yeah.
we don't recognize it as such because what we want is to talk to the computer. We want to
Right.
say hi, and we want it to have thoughts and feelings just like us. And we don't
Just
see
like
that.
us.
So what's
Yeah.
that?
No, just like right. We want us.
Yeah, we don't want intelligence. We want a mirror.
Yeah.
We want a black mirror, to
Yeah. Which is
point
why
out
I like. Which
without
is
the
why I'm
obvious title.
infinitely fascinated with the movie Her.
Right. Yeah.
As a, I mean, I see that movie as the way to make sense. The way to read that movie is to see it as akin to like the Matrix and Terminator.
Yeah.
Except the apocalypse is not, because right, even in the Matrix and the Terminator, humans are still important, right? They still need us. So what I like about Her
In the
is
Matrix, less so in the Terminator.
but the Terminator, they want to get rid of us, right? We still matter, and like
yeah, we give them purpose, which
right. Where in Her, the artifact, they just dump us because we're just sad and high-waisted pants, right? We're so what makes it apocalyptic is we're no longer the gold standard for the things we think are important to human. We're just kind of unfulfilling partners in a relationship.
Yeah. Well, and so there is space for this in the introduction. I don't know how much.
But this is definitely something though that could get folded in. Because I'm thinking too about, as I'm moving into writing about the way in which compensation levels work, that I think there's something about how these particular tasks get compensated that gets into the realm of judgment about what kinds of things are more valuable than other kinds of things. And I think that starts to get into these sort of ethical questions, right? That how much, right, that piece about, Amazon Turks had me relive my most traumatic memories for 50 cents a task, right? There's a sense in which that's getting at that kind of, right, that the unstated premise behind a piece like that is that human trauma is somehow valuable and unique and should be compensated as such. So there's a kind of ethical basis that in Mechanical Turk shows up potentially, or one of the ways we could read it as that's what the compensation levels give us purchase on, which is how, now here's how the human gets articulated within these particular tasks. And then we can see how things that we might parse differently in common sense terms get entangled inside Mechanical Turks. And then the second move in the discussions, and now here's how compensation levels gets into questions of valuation and.
Well, see, so that's kind of the other option is, that kind of digression or discourse that is really all in the discussion, right? I mean, I should say the way this is written now, really all the parts, pretty much all of that is in the discussion. It's sort of a more clean break.
Yeah.
That, the sections are kind of doing different jobs in different ways. There would be, I think, space to potentially signpost that in the intro. I mean, even just through brief reference and then return to it. But like the introduction right now doesn't really like set up like the Kang and this is a larger sort of historical movement. Right now it doesn't do that. If you look at the parts of it, and right now it's about, let's see, it's about 3 pages. Yeah, it's about 1,000 words. So that's another thing, is like, how sprawling did I want the intro to be? And so I was working, I think, to be concise. So it goes from, as we talked about, sort of a general overview of what the Turk is and what the name is and kind of means. It then points out, and this is something like, here's where Poe gets checked, is here in the second paragraph where it's talking about the name. It points out that it kind of purported to be purely mechanical, but in fact had Confederates. Both somebody, and this is kind of important, both somebody in the Turk cabinet, but also at least one other person outside of it. It's
that was just as important to pulling off the effect.
And, you don't need to get into this too much, but, another player and an audience, right? I mean,
Yeah.
a room. I mean, the room itself, it's a really good example of, people wanting an either or here. It is a chess playing robot just in a vacuum, or it's somebody inside it pulling its strings. And it's like, yeah, but I mean, it takes all the, it's got a couple of people as operators at least.
Yeah.
It's got a device, at least one device. It's got a opponent who is, just as important in a magic trick. You need a volunteer from the audience.
Right. I've never met you before, madam. Is that correct?
Well, and it's like, was that person a plant? Yes. Or it's like, well, sometimes, but not always. I mean, like here, Napoleon was not a plant, but he was still super important.
Yeah. And right. And then an audience that's willing to go along with it.
Yeah. I mean, the audience is important.
A culture, right? I mean, as Kang would point out, at this moment, a culture obsessed with automatons, right? And exploring the boundaries of what one could do. So, so that the I forget his name now, right? But the guy that builds it kind of as a challenge, right? Can I make an automaton that outstrips the previous ones? So
yeah, and his motivations there were interesting because, I mean, partially they were financial.
Yeah, he was trying to get a patron.
Just like in Turk, it's like, I mean, commerce again kind of manifests as this interesting.
Well, that was something I was going to bring up, that Mechanical Turks started as an internal mechanism for Amazon. And then they thought, well, this is actually something we could potentially monetize. I mean, it was originally done as a kind of in-house problem solving. And then, right, well, this maybe works. Let's make this a service.
Right.
So it didn't even start as a service. It just started as a logistics thing within Amazon.
Well, so this is where Poe gets checked, because it's really just, it's footnoted.
Yeah.
Because it says, it's about, were people fooled by this or not? And it mentions, that's, debatable. Some people, of course, were credulous. Some people are credulous about anything. I mean, people think wireless networks cause a virus right now. There are going to be people who are credulous about anything, but this is always interesting about kind of the hubris of the present, right? It's like these people a couple hundred years ago at most,
right,
were such rubes that they believed this. It's like, probably not. I mean, we're not talking about proto-humans.
Right.
We're talking about people who were led into a theater and given very controlled interactions with it. And it's like, oh yeah, it's a chess playing automaton, but you only see one side of it at a time,
Right. Yeah. And there's also a kind of narrative. This is unrelated, but anyway, the long story short, right. The idea that Christopher Columbus had to convince people that the earth was round.
Yeah.
Like, no.
We knew it wasn't round since prehistory.
Yes. Yeah. It was just a debate about how big it was. But right, in many ways,
we knew that too.
The myth that people thought the earth was flat is actually a myth that was created in about the 19th century to sort of as science was. I mean, in many ways, weirdly enough, that is science. Again, broad generations, like science made that myth up to differentiate itself, right? In many ways, that's a myth that's generated by science's need to make a case for itself, right? Without science, people would have believed this. So it's really interesting. But the same as this, right? This need to, if you're going to sort of bona fide, establish your bona fides as a scientist, you need this foil of a vast populace that's absolutely incredulous with respect to. It's like, no, most people saw this and goes, yeah, no, this is like when the lady gets sawed in half. We know that a lady's not actually being sawed in half.
Well, so that's what this points out, is it says, as with any good magic trick, it would seem that many, if not most, observers understood they were encountering illusion, but that in no way undercut their fascination with the performance, because it points out that Poe's thing, I mean, his essay isn't it's not really, is this a robot? Is it not a robot? It's how did
Yeah.
this, what's the effect here? How are they
Yeah.
doing this?
How is this working?
Right.
How is human agency being distributed into this machine?
It's kind of a, sort of Penn and Teller. They know they're not seeing magic tricks. They're
Yeah.
amazed at how, how are you doing this?
Yeah. To a certain extent, it'd be a bummer if it was just magic.
Yeah. Because yeah, I mean, that's kind of
They're doing it the hard way.
yeah. Once you find out about what magic is, it's, it's insane preparation.
Yeah.
And things like percentages. It's like, can I induce someone to make a particular action through, training that is borderline obsessive? And if they don't, I know 3 times out of 4, they're going to pick this card because of the way I've set up the environment to induce that.
Yeah.
But if they don't, here's what I do next. I mean, it's just, practice so that it becomes,
Yeah.
I've covered all the angles here.
Yeah. Yeah. It ends up being much more impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, was it a chess playing automaton? No, it was actually a complex mechanical device and series of performative moves
Right.
that created the illusion of a mechanical Turk. It's actually more impressive, not less impressive. Or differently impressive.
Yeah. So it addresses that, and then it moves on to that MTurk is a topic in other disciplines, particularly economics, big surprise there. But then also psychology, sociology, education. Although even then, a lot of these, just a lot of studies that include Turk are more about its use than it as a subject. Perhaps understandably, it's mostly economics where they're looking at it as a subject, right? I mean, what are the demographics of this thing? How is it impacting wages? Those are really largely kind of economic questions. And most of these others, what they're really looking at is stuff like, say you have a class of, psychology or sociology 101, and you give them a questionnaire, and then you put a questionnaire on MTurk, are the results that different? I mean, they're kind of these backdoor questions of, how human is mechanical Turk, because it's like, do you get, similar results from questionnaires that you would from a pool of people? So like in psych and soc, they're almost these kind of functional questions of, can I use it the way I would use, a big pool of in-person surveys or whatever. But anyway, I mean, they're still doing research there. Anyway, so I mean, it just briefly sort of talks about other fields do this. However, in rhetoric and in adjacent fields such as computational linguistics, there's not a whole ton, and what is there is really use of MTurk to produce research rather than looking at it as a topic. There's just not a lot. And then it says, it's unfortunate because this basically is explaining, here's what they've said in other fields. Here's what they said in our field, which is not a whole lot. Here's why it would be valuable to look at it, right? I mean, because it's this big body of texts that addresses questions of ethos and persuasion. I mean, it's explicitly persuasive. It has to get people to do stuff.
Right.
And this is
and in particular ways too.
Yeah. I mean, that's in fact part of the discussion of what makes a good and a bad hit. It's persuasive. Some of them stick because they're not persuasive for different reasons. They're either ambiguous, which people, Turkers just don't have time to waste on sussing out intent and meaning because, we're talking about having to do these jobs very rapidly, right? Yeah. So, I mean, it's really kind of interesting from sort of like a tech writing standpoint, because you have to communicate,
right?
This is what you need to do in just a completely clear, completely fast way.
Yeah.
But anywho,
pedagogical in that way too.
What's that?
They're pedagogical in that way too.
Right. I mean, it's training. It has to be either, doing training or appealing to a known uh, trope of education, right? You know how to do X. I'm asking you to do a version of that. Anywho, so it says, it'd be valuable because it's this thing, and it'd be a counterpoint because conversations about this split often zoom into abstract intellectual ethical traits, is what we
Yeah.
just discussed. And that stretches back as far as, at least as far as the Phaedrus, probably farther.
No, and this is helpful setup, because I mean that's part of what I've, as we talked about last time, that trying to sort of figure out the discussion section is that what Mechanical Turks, right, that normally our instinct, and even mine as I'm writing that section, is to look, right, if we're going to make these distinctions, we tend to jump quickly to the abstract,
Yeah.
and then use that abstraction to look at what's in front of us.
Yep.
And I think our move is, we'll know that whatever that distinction is, that distinction's always being made through practice, not ahead of practice.
Right.
And that's kind of our, so that's kind of that's what we're interested in Mechanical Turks, is not how its distinctions either align or don't align with these categories, that's the kind of ethical move, right? Because then that allows us to ostensibly judge Mechanical Turks against some abstract standard of what, right? See how Mechanical Turks is dehumanizing because it's having people do, right? And what we're interested in is, no, how does Mechanical Turks itself make these distinctions, even not even purposely, right? That it might actually just be sort of, it winds up with these sets of distinctions based on the kinds of tasks it's trying to get accomplished.
Yeah.
And that sort of heads down the road to that theoretical piece, right? That's the sort of implicit cultural techniques move here, is that no, that the concept of the human is always a function of a set of material practices that generate those distinctions, so that the concept is an effect of something, not the cause of it.
Yeah. And the conclusion does point in that direction. And here in the intro, and you'll notice like this is not that long, but I mean, like this is a long paragraph that could be split up because it covers, here's what they've said in other areas. They haven't said a lot in our and related areas. It'd be valuable. And then here's kind of the break point of, this is a valuable counterpoint, where this could be its own longer discussion about this conversation of, of ethics and pre-existing frameworks.
Yeah.
Because this is where it turns to Plato. And then it says, the influence of new materialism has kind of inverted that, where, it's taken in many ways the same structure of hierarchy, right? Human is the good, special, cool thing, which we get from Plato, but also, of course, through things like monotheistic religion. I mean, Christianity is the, and I don't mention this, but I mean, it's the perfect thing of, well, the human is a good, special thing, and everything else is subordinate.
Right.
Being here. And, a lot of sort of conversations of digital tech accept that, but invert it, right? Where it's like, well, no, the computer is the special thing, but you're still in the same binary there.
Right. Yeah.
It's just flipped.
Which is kind of, I mean, that was, to a certain extent, I think we were talking about this a couple episodes ago, right? The idea that what we would see in Mechanical Turk would be a kind of inversion. And actually that's not what we're seeing, is some pretty complex entanglement of these distinctions, and those distinctions vary from task to task, right? So in a certain sense, what we don't get from Mechanical Turks is, I mean, I think potentially, right, and we're probably sort of using our prior selves as too much of a foil, right? But the idea that we would get a clear distinction, that here's how Mechanical Turks makes this distinction.
Yeah.
And what we find is Mechanical Turks doesn't make a distinction, right? That in many ways, Mechanical Turks is a nest of distinctions that are oftentimes it doesn't make one coherent distinction.
Well, and so that comes up, and this is something to discuss. So, I mean, in here, it points toward, and I don't think it shows its hand, but it points toward, MTurk providing a bottom-up depiction rather than a top-down one that inherits pre-existing frameworks, right? But now here it points to, it says a realignment of labor along an axis spanning humans and digital machines would produce a corresponding revised human ethos, a group identity based on what we do in this are. And then it points to Tours, Polanyi's paradox, right? And how it does a realignment, right? Based on really articulation and automation, right? So can your task be articulated? That's what Polanyi's paradox kind of is. Tours looking at why in a period of digital automation do you see growth at kind of these divergent or separate poles based on things like education and compensation, right? So things that require a lot of education and are really well compensated, those grow in digital automation. And then at the other end, things that are not well compensated, but are things like physical labor jobs. Why do those two grow? The middle gets kind of impeded, as it were, by automation, but those two grow. And so he says, well, if you look at them, they have these similarities explicable through Polanyi, which is they require these things that are difficult for us to articulate, right? Either like creative capacities, problem-solving capacities. Those are the high end of the spectrum. The low end deal with things like bodily knowledge and adaptability. I mean, we've talked about the difficulty of building a strawberry picking robot because, picking strawberries is this very hard, but also very complicated physical task, but you don't think of it in terms of complexity. But like, applying appropriate pressure to pick a strawberry that, you need to get it off the vine, but you can't crush it. Mm-hmm. It's very tough to, our hands know how to do that implicitly. Well, maybe not implicit, but our hands know how to do that. But it's tough to tell a machine how to do that, So he says, if you look at those two poles, those are the similarities there. There's this kind of, it's difficult to articulate what happens there. So that's the axis. This also then talks about COVID, and it's just for a bit. This is the intro. So it's basically just kind of mentioning, here are two examples of realignments of labor, right? Tours thing, and then COVID's realignment of essential and inessential, right?
Yeah.
And then it points out, it says our goal then is something similar to that, to determine the ways MTurk makes a commensurate change in the labor calculus and thereby revises human and digital machine. And you can see what it's setting up, and I haven't put this, is what we talk about in the conclusion, which is, we want that, but we don't really find that.
Yeah.
As it points out in the conclusion, kind of one of our principal findings is a non-finding. Mm-hmm. That we want this, but we don't find that precisely. We don't find a bright line that, MTurk tells us this is what humans do, sort of like the Simpsons joke. This is what humans are like, and this is what machines are like. Right? Yeah. We don't quite find that bright of a line. I think we do find certain coherent patterns of things that come up in the conclusion, right? The image of the human that comes out of that has a certain knowledge of particular domains, like branding. It has these kind of bodily knowledges, but a bright line of this is what humans are now, and this is what machines are now is a little bit elusive.
Yeah.
So in a way, and this is kind of setting that up. I am going to put a thumbnail of that because, just because a good, this needs a thesis, right? It needs a statement of here is what we found. It's got research questions, right? Here's what the research questions are. But in this kind of research, there's no need to be coy.
Right.
It's not like, here's what our research questions are and read on if you want to know the answers.
It's not a murder mystery.
No, it's not, reading Rainbow, one of my favorite touchstones, where they say, if you want to know more, read the book. Right?
Yeah.
because they're trying to get people to do that. In this kind of work, this isn't that. You put,
Yeah.
here's what we found, and then you point out the research. It's not, here's what we're gonna do.
Yeah, I know that, and that is my. I mean, I think that's the mode for other kinds of writing. Whereas, I mean, this is sort of right. This is in many ways a report of research that's been done. Whereas a lot of, right, I'm thinking about when Latour writes about sociology, right? That the experiment of sociology takes place in the writing. It's not reported by the writing, and we're kind of in a mode where actually we are kind of reporting what we're not. The writing isn't itself doing the experiment; it's describing an experiment we already.
I mean, at this point, I mean, this is something I talk about, and IMRAD structure is set up for this. The work is done.
Right.
There's no secret. You found it. Here's what we're going into trying to find. Here's how we set it up. Here's what we found. So the work is done.
Yeah.
And so this kind of structure and this kind of research, there's no reason to be coy. You've got the answer, even if that, here's our hypothesis, and you know what, it wasn't supported. That. I mean, it's like you have to envision yourself writing the abstract of this.
Right.
And it's like, here's what we did, here's what we found. It's not, it's not, here's what we're gonna do. It's
right.
It's done. It's done. I mean, as I talk about with students about this, it's front loaded. There's no reason to be coy. It's like, here's what we found. And, and the question that always follows is, then why do you need the rest of the paper? Because it's showing you, here's the proof. Here's what happened. You don't just take things on face value. Abraham Lincoln poisoned his school children. You look for the proof, and the rest is the proof. Anywho, so this transitions to, this study addresses these research questions, right? So how do hits rhetorically construct distinctions between humans and digital machines based on labor and agency? And then I also just wanted to put a little bit here about, to answer these questions, we wanted to cleave close to the language of hits. There's lots of ways you could answer this question, right? I mean, if this is your research question, there's a million ways you could answer that. And I mean, kind of conventionally in rhetoric, your first answer wouldn't be text mining.
Right.
I mean, my proof for that is no one else has done it. Our answers usually don't. I mean, in rhetoric studies, it's less. I mean, there's more of these now, but a lot of times your first answer in rhetoric isn't, well, let's do text mining. More people are doing that. I mean, we talked with Scott, right?
Yep.
I mean, his first answer might be, well, let's do text mining,
Yeah.
But anywho.
He's a weirdo.
Well, and there's more folks, doing this kind of stuff, and this gets talked about in the methods, right? But
yeah,
we do need to kind of point out, to answer this question, we wanted to look at the language in particular ways, in kind of quantitative ways. And obviously the method section is going to unpack that, but you want to say, here's how we're addressing those questions. And then, a thumbnail of, here's what we found. Here's what our thesis, right? A research question is not a thesis. The answer to the research question is the thesis, right? A thesis is a statement. Here's what it is. Sorry, I'm already getting cranked up to teach. I mean, I can feel these conversations happening.
Yeah. Well, no, and I think too, that's part of what we were talking about a couple of minutes ago, is, oftentimes I think the move to text mining is in part the move to avoid the kind of abstract distinctions that we would use to organize the difference between humans and non-humans, right? That if you really want to avoid falling back on that, you kind of need a large corpus of things so you can watch that distinction emerge.
Yeah. I'll put a note about that.
So in that sense, our choice of text mining as a method is part and parcel with the kind of theoretical framework that we're approaching this with. Right. If you want to see and again, we're not necessarily using this language now, but for the project as a whole, right? If we want to sort of mark a cultural technique, you've got to, you need a kind of big sample size to do that.
Right. Yeah.
So if you want to do bottoms up, you need a big bottom.
Sorry, I'm making a note. Yeah. Yes, that's a good point. That it's not an arbitrary choice of method.
No.
It's because we're trying to do things in a particular way in order to add a kind of counterpoint to this conversation.
Yeah, that one of the ways that I mean, we could make the case that if we're trying to avoid the kind of Platonic instinct, that we see data mining as a practice that it counterbalances that instinct.
Yeah, even though of course, I mean that's fraud, but I mean we have to do something,
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is a move. Anywho, so there's that, and then it kind of ends with this larger statement of, as we've talked about, we're not using, well, I guess the sentence kind of points it out. It's crucial to acknowledge that we don't position this as an attempt to discover objective separations. M-Turk is not a window that provides insight into true essences, nor a subsidiary symptom of a broader political, social, or economic prime mover.
That's that. I mean, that, that shit needs to be italicized. I mean, I think that's a big, important thing that I can imagine I can imagine even at this stage, someone reading our pieces as thinking that that's what we're doing. That we're trying to use Mechanical Turk to see something else.
Right. See, and that's the thing is we often kind of fall into, it shows us the operations of these other black box forces. Like, it's like, and you see this in a lot of conversations, like, well, no, this is really a question of poverty, not race. Well, no, it's really a question of, it's like, well, you keep trying to find this atom that's going to explain it. It's like, you're not going to find that, right?
Right.
This isn't a viewmaster that shows you, well, here's the actual prime moving force. I mean, that's
Right.
Good luck with that
Yeah.
impulse. Anywho, the study's goal is to trace in a circumscribed way, how M-Turk continually remakes distinctions between humans and non-humans. We're following McLuhan, so it's not a cop-out necessarily. It's a method. So anyway, that's the gist of how this is going. And as I mentioned, one thing you'll notice here is right now, I think there are, even as written, a couple places where stuff from the discussion, potentially like this part, as we were talking about, like the Kang stuff. So maybe a conversation about, bless you, historicizing or this notion, this sort of Platonic inheritance. There may even, as written, be places where some of the discussion stuff can get revised into the introduction.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, there are ways to revise the introduction more radically. And as you point out, I mean, like the Poe and the Kang are a larger component of the introduction. I mean, I'm not married to the introduction as written. It's just, it's one way to work things up. And what that means is it does put a lot, like all of that stuff into then the discussion. That's what the discussion then is, right? I mean, it's the section where all of that stuff manifests.
Yeah, and I think maybe then once that gets done, we can then see, depending on how that discussion section ends up landing, whether we just want to keep it there or we sprinkle some of that stuff into the introduction.
Right. And I mean, that was the original intent, was to write this section last, because then we'd know, how much needs to be signposted in the discussion, or excuse me, in the introduction that signposts the discussion. So it's not like it's out of left field.
Right.
It's addressed here. So, that was the original intent. This is really, a skeleton that we can use, but like all of these, it probably will benefit from revision. All right, well, let's see. Yeah, that's the gist of it.
Excellent.
And as I said, I mean, it's right now, it's 1,000 words. I don't think I want the introduction to be super long. I mean, because like,
Yeah.
you know, the results section is long. And you know, the meat of this is really the results in the discussion. I mean, what'd you find and what does that mean?
Yeah.
You know, things like the methods are important for explaining what you're doing, but the meat of this is, yeah, but what'd you find and what does that mean? And then the intro and, you know, conclusion are really just kind of buttons. All right. Yeah, well, it's been an hour. Anything else here or?
No, and I'm gonna get cracking on the discussion section.
Have you been talking to Jeff at all or?
It's been a while.
Okay. Because I mean, probably then we should inform them like, hey, we got a draft together, just so they know we're not just out in the ether here.
Yeah.
Once that last section is, because I mean, you know, we've been doing. Oh, okay. We've been doing, you know, we've been doing the labor, but you know, actually having a draft of the manuscript, I think is.
Yeah. Something to show for it.
Hokey doke.
Okay.
All right. Well, I guess I will see you in a couple of weeks.
Sounds good.
All right. Let's see.